You know, in a lot of academic circles, fan fiction or fanfic has kind of a bad reputation. It has a reputation for being kind of amateurish and lame, and so sometimes I'll hear people dismiss fanfic altogether as being unimportant or a trifle and not worth thinking about. But some of the greatest works of literature ever were fan fiction, and one of the most important of those is John Milton's Paradise Lost. We might not normally think about it as fan fiction, but what is fan fiction? Fan fiction is when a writer takes characters from a story that he didn't create, in a universe he didn't make, and then makes his own story out of it. And this is what we see here in Milton's Paradise Lost. He takes the first 3 chapters of Genesis. The first 3 chapters of Genesis work out to fewer than 100 verses. And so they're pretty short, and there's not a lot of detail getting us from creation to the fall of man. There's very little there, in fact, at all. And so what Milton does is he's going to expand on that in Paradise Lost. But like a lot of fan fiction, he has a purpose in doing this. And he opens Paradise Lost by saying, "Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe with the loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, on that secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. In the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos." And he goes on from there. So first of all, he opens with a setting, the creation of the world. But it's not just, well, this is set in the world like all stories. Rather, he's specifically going to start with the account of creation found in Genesis, and he has a purpose, which he then gets to about 20 lines later, where he says that to the height of this great argument, I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. So he says, I have a purpose here. I'm going to expand on these first 3 chapters of Genesis that talk about creation and the fall of man to explain why it might be that God did this for us. And so within this, we not only see that, but we also see this reference to the heavenly muse, Oreb, Sinai, Zion Hill. And we go further on and we start seeing these kind of Greek mythological references. And throughout Paradise Lost, you see Greek mythological references. Why are those there? It's like a typical fan fiction mashup. I like this universe, I like that universe, but they're not in the same universe. So what I'll do is I'll do a mashup and I'll put them together. You know, what happened to the characters from this universe met the characters from this universe? Well, what he does is he says, let's take the characters who I love from classical mythology, and I will put them in the story of Genesis in some way. And he does many things with them. Largely, he turns these gods into false gods, into the kind of demons that you might find in the Bible. So he has a purpose, and he tells us he's going to do a mashup from the beginning. He's going to mix the classical world with the world of Genesis, and he's going to expand on this to explain the ways of God to man. Well, not only that, but of course there are many different things, many different directions that fan fiction take. One important element is slash fiction, where you take 2 characters who did not maybe have sex in the existing stories, and you have them have sex in your story. You imagine what would happen. Well, he does this a couple times. In book 9, he takes 2 characters who did have sex in Genesis, Adam and Eve, and he describes their first sexual encounter after the fall, how it becomes full of lust and shame and self-recrimination. But that already exists in Genesis. In Paradise Lost, he also adds, in great fanfic style, another sex scene where he takes 2 characters who you wouldn't normally think of as having sex. Satan and Sin. And you might think Sin is not a character, but in fact, in book 2 of Paradise Lost, we find Satan meets this figure, and she is the figure of sin, and with her is the figure of death. And in his descriptions, of these characters, he's actually telling us something about how he perceives sin and death. So sin is like a woman from above the waist and below. She is this serpent figure with these serpents, almost like like an octopus mermaid of snakes or something. And his description of death is really interesting because he describes death in impossible ways or in vague ways, and allows your imagination to play on that. And he does this many times. A very famous line is when he describes hell as darkness visible. Two things which we think about as normally not going together. He puts them together in a way that causes your imagination to think, what is a visible darkness? What does that mean, for example? And he says, the other shape, describing death, if shape it might be called, that shape had none. So there's another shape, if you can call it a shape, that didn't have a shape. Distinguishable in member, joint, or limb, or substance, that might be called shadow. That might be called that shadow seemed. So it had substance, but it actually seemed like it was shadow. For each seemed either black it stood as night, terrible as 10 furies, terrible as hell, and shook a dreadful dart. What seemed his head, the likeness of a kingly crown had on. So it kind of seemed to have a head with maybe a crown. Maybe it kind of seemed that way, but it's hard to tell. And death comes, Satan comes along these two figures, and death comes and threatens Satan, and Satan's like, I'm not afraid of you, I'm not afraid of anybody except God and the Son of God who's going to come. And he says to the female figure, Sin, he says, who are you? And she's like, don't you remember me, Dad? And basically she then tells the story of how she and death were created. And basically what happens is Satan is sort of plotting up in heaven and out of the plotting against heaven, and out of the left side of his head, like in Greek mythology, outburst sin from his very head. He sort of gave birth to her, and she's his daughter. But then after that, he secretly has sex with her and rapes her and gets her pregnant with this child who's Death. Death who literally, violently tears through her entrails to get out in the world, and that's his son. And so there's this weird kind of disturbing fan fiction-y kind of incest going on here, where you have this unholy trinity of Satan and sin and death together. So we do have a lot of things in here that we might associate with fan fiction. But what about that Mary Sue moment? One of the things that you'll often find in fan fiction is that in fan fiction, we'll see people who will put characters in there who are very similar to them, but an idealized version of them. So, and the most famous one of these was Mary Sue from a set of Star Trek fan fiction stories, where Mary Sue was always the youngest and the smartest and the best, who would then the main stars of the show, or the main characters of the show, she would charm with her brilliance, and they'd take her under her wing, and sometimes there'd be a romantic relationship, and then she would save the day in some way. And it's always kind of the idea of Mary Sue is that there's this kind of idealized version of yourself in there, and it's a wish fulfillment. If I were in the story, I wish I were like this, and I wish I were so wonderful. Is there a Mary Sue moment in Paradise Lost? Because you would think there wouldn't be, since this is about the fall of man, and clearly there aren't that many other characters to choose from. You got some angels, you got Satan. I mean, literally sin and death have to be personified in order to get this other this other relationship in there. So how does Milton bring himself and us into it? Well, one way in which he does it is sort of a more subtle way, where in these descriptions of sin, in his descriptions of the way that Adam and Eve approach one another, the way that they rationalize their behavior, that they try to justify their sin, the way that they accuse one another of the things that they themselves have done wrong, that in some way Milton, and by extension we, are convicted of that. But I think the greatest Mary Sue moment of all in Paradise Lost are the very last lines. In the end of Book 12. In the end of Book 12, Adam and Eve have been cast out of the garden. They've been sent out on their own. They have sinned. They accused one another. They considered breaking up, basically having nothing to do with one another, but they've reconciled together. And we read here at the very end of Book 12, the very end of Paradise Lost, with some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand, and wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. And I think here is perhaps one of the most beautiful Mary Sue moments of all, where Milton, describing not just himself, but all of us, that we are hand in hand, but alone in a fallen world, with only Providence as our guide.